Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode originally aired April 11th, 2014. It features myself and my friend Pat Mullen having a discussion about the villains of Thor, limited primarily to the comic books. We do touch a little bit on the MCU, but again, 2014, we didn't quite have the same just amount of material to work with when it came to the movies as we do now, so just be a little bit kind about that. Thor is, I believe, Pat's favorite comic book character, certainly one of, if not at the top of his list, so it was a fun time to have talking with him about some of the characters from the comics who we might want to see brought to life, who hadn't been brought to life, some of the portrayals of characters in film and television, other mediums, and so on and so forth. So it's a fun time, and Thor has some. You may not think about it because you don't think of too many of Thor villains off the top of your head, and for all of you screaming Loki, work with me here. Thor's got a richer rogues gallery than you might expect if all you know is his appearances in the MCU. I mean, just put it like that, and we have a pretty decent discussion centered around that kind of thought process here. So before we get further, before I throw it to myself in the past, thank you for interacting with the product a little bit. Like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend, tell an enemy. I'm good with either of those. Also, let's pay some bills, get the sponsors out of the way. First, Amazon Music Unlimited. The unlimited service, it gives you access to over 70 million songs and other podcasts and materials and whatnot, and you can have a free 30 days of that particular service on us. There's a link in the description to getamazonmusic.com/W2M network. Click on that, fill out the little form they give you. It lets them know that we sent you there, and you can enjoy 30 days for free of that particular service. If at the end of that time period you still enjoy it, you can start paying for it. If not, well, you lost nothing, and you had, again, a free 30 days. Again, you risk nothing by doing this. All you can do is benefit. Also, helping out the podcast financially a little bit is Grammarly. For you listeners of the W2M network, Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2M network. Again, that's getgrammarly. I can enunciate. getgrammarly.com/W2M network to download Grammarly for free. There are links to both of those in the description below if you'd rather just click on that. And I don't blame you if you'd rather click than type. So, with that out of the way, let me throw this back to myself and Pat Mullen. In the past, in the aftermath of WrestleMania 30, actually, we open a little bit talking about the fallout of that particular event. Oh, boy. I couldn't cut it out because it's interspersed with, it would have been too much of an editing hassle, but there's some interesting discussion at the beginning of the episode that... Oh, boy, it's something. All right, past me and Pat, the floor is now yours. Best of luck to you, sirs.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pebble in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every this is the life you see. The devil tips his hat to me. I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to another edition of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. I am your host, your authority on evil, Mr. Robert Winfree. Again, thank you for joining us live, download, however you choose to do it. I'm glad you clicked that button. I'm glad you're listening in. If you like the show, tell two friends, tell two friends. It's a pyramid scheme. That's what this is, folks, but with no money made by anyone. I'm not quite sure what that is other than some form of government. All right, bad jokes aside, here on Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, we are continuing to slog through comic book villains. That's right, it's been many weeks running. It'll be many more weeks going forward. And I'm still just pressing on. I got nothing better to do. I will say this. Triple H, for professional wrestling fans out there, had two opportunities to be the subject of discussion here on this podcast. Both of them involved him becoming WWE World Heavyweight Champion at WrestleMania or the Raw following WrestleMania. Had he done so, the internet would have exploded for a couple of seconds, and he would have got his own show. Everyone could have called in and complained about him, and we would have brought up his long, sad history and the whole nine yards. That's just what we would have done, but he didn't. He is not the champion, and so he's not going to be mentioned again until I get into wrestling villains, which I will at some point because it's topical, and it's another thing that people in my sphere seem to know about. But we are doing comics, and I've got a special guest, again. He's kind of a regular here, and I'd like to thank him for doing so. I'd also like to thank him for coming out of his, depression at Daniel Bryan becoming the WWE World Heavyweight Champion. But Pat Mullen is here with us, so we're breaking his depression. We're talking about one of his favorite subjects. Everybody be nice to Pat. He's still in mourning because professional wrestling is dead, right?
And there came a day unlike any other.
All right, so how you doing today, Pat? Are you, is the gun still at your head, metaphorically?
Well, yes, but that's a plus because I took it out of my mouth, so we're making progress.
You know, I would never go through them. The odds of actually causing enough trauma to end your life are too.
Well, I angled it upward so it would go to the brain.
I'm just saying, you know, if you're going to use a gun, don't go through them. There's enough of a chance that you will not do the job properly that it's not worth the risk.
I should probably look into a DNR then.
I don't even mean like that. I just mean like you blow half your face off and you survive just fine. You just now.
Oh, no way do I want to go through life looking like. Yeah, no way do I want to go through life looking like Mary Jo Buttafuoco.
All right. Random jokes aside, and our commentary on professional wrestling aside, when I started announced I was doing comic book characters, and that was going to be a long, ongoing series. I had requests. People said, you will have me on this for this show, or I will be angry. I will never forgive you. I will find you in the middle of Utah and exact horrifying vengeance. And you said that about Thor. And it's long known that isn't he your favorite comic book character, series, franchise, etc.?
Oh, by far.
How did you arrive at that? I'm just curious.
You know, Thor was my dad's favorite comic book, and when I was growing up, most of what I read was Marvel, and most of what I read was geared towards his taste. So I read Thor, I read Captain America, I read the Fantastic Four. And initially I was a big fan of the Captain America books, because at the time I thought they were just, the best ones out there with the best stories. But, after a while I got to get some old Thor stuff, and really what hooked me more than anything was the Walt Simonson run in the 80s, which was just still, to me, the best comic storytelling on any single character by one writer and / artist by far. And he took villains that were maligned and made them interesting. He created a great new adversary, and he really kind of took you in depth with Thor, which a lot of people don't often do. They just kind of have you, he runs in, does the Shakespearean speech, and bashes people with a hammer, which is fun, but there's got to be more to him than that, considering he's several millennia old and happens to be an actual Norse deity and has seen worlds most people only dream of. And he's going to come across some baddies in that time. And I thought that run was just so good that when I finally saw other writers start to explore that a little more, like Dan Jurgens, who had a great run, and most recently in the storyline that featured the creation of Gore the God Butcher, who we may get to, by Jason Aaron, and the J. Michael Straczynski series. They were all just fantastic and really showed you the potential of his character and a lot of the potential of his adversaries.
He's the, that's one of the things about Thor is he's not one of these heroes that is kind of based on Earth. I mean, he lives there more or less. That's kind of his base of operations, but it's rare that you see certain heroes like Batman or Superman to some extent, Iron Man, by and large, they kind of stick with Earth and problems related to Earth. There are a couple that will go anywhere across, untold, millions of light years and through dimensions, and, the Fantastic Four kind of does that, Green Lantern kind of does that, and I don't think anybody does it to quite the extent that Thor does, and that just opens up all kinds of fun possibilities for what he encounters, and I suppose kind of the irony is that one of his most famous at this point, his most famous villain opposing force is actually his brother, half-brother, Loki. And
you don't have to be Shakespeare to appreciate that kind of irony. I think anyone who's grown up with a sibling, be it older or younger, knows that no matter what, there's always a somewhat adversarial relationship between you. Who do your parents like better? Who's first in line for this? Who gets this? And they take it with Loki, who also just happens to be adopted, which is a whole nother bag of worms, and just it really plays it to the complete hilt that you can.
Well, that's one of the things I kind of appreciated that they did with, in the comics and in the films, that they kind of go into his backstory a little bit, because before I was aware of Thor as a graphic novel, a comic series, I was a big fan of mythology, both Greek and Norse, and so I was well aware that Loki was not actually an Asgardian nor a god. He was, in traditional mythology, he's a half-giant who Odin swore brotherhood to.
Yeah, and a half-wolf.
And he proceeds to use that to get into and out of all kinds of trouble. But he's an interesting character in the sense that he's one of those guys who you can kind of see where he's coming from. I mean, whether you agree or not, his motivation makes sense. It's logical, consistent character development.
Yeah, in the comic books, and the film really does a good job of bringing this out to the masses, because some people who read the comics even had no idea. Loki was rescued as this child by Odin, who had waged war with the Frost Giants, marched into their home of Jotunheim, and just wrecked house, and then found this baby who he knew to be the son of the king of the Frost Giants at the time, Laufey, and wanted to use him as a bargaining piece in the future to bring about peace between the city of Asgard amidst the realm of Asgard and Jotunheim in the area occupied by the Frost Giants as opposed to the actual giants. And when you find out that it's not necessarily that they took you in out of mercy or a parental instinct, but you were going to be kind of a bargaining chip your whole life, you were never in line for this throne that's held by your father, it was always about your brother, you kind of get a little bit angry, and you will develop a complex at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, under any circumstances, that particular set of circumstances engenders, various degrees of mental unhealth. And when you factor in Asgardian powers, magic, lifespan, ego, and all, you just exacerbate everything, and it doesn't end well, and it very infrequently ends well for Loki. Although apparently in the last movie, he is now on the throne for what I have to assume is going to last until the next Thor movie.
Could be earlier, could be sooner.
Well, it could be. So that kind of brings up, what did you think of, now, I was not the biggest fan of the comics when I read a few of them, and for me it was just kind of the language barrier, which is odd because I really enjoy reading Shakespeare. But I had a little bit of trouble really getting into it, but I went and saw the movie because I was really interested. I know a fair amount about the mythology from like a research standpoint. And, to be up there acting opposite Anthony Hopkins and to steal the spotlight at times, I can't say enough good things about Tom Hiddleston. So did that work for you? I mean, you've been known to be in the minority from time to time, as have I, on various issues. Did you enjoy his portrayal of Loki, or was there something you found lacking, some other guy you would have preferred to see do it?
No, I absolutely love Tom Hiddleston as Loki. I think he's arguably along with Robert Downey Jr., the acting high point of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He really takes the best moments throughout Loki's printed run, and there are guys who had a much better handle on how to use Loki than others in terms of the guys who've written the comic. And again, I'll point to guys like Walt Simonson, J. Michael Straczynski in those instances. And it's very much like Hiddleston only took inspiration from those and was able to block out any time that Loki just was not written well or written very against his character that you'd come to know and appreciate. And he just knocked it out of the park.
I mean, I maintain that the best parts of either of the Thor movies, and I would even go so far as to, by and large, include the Avengers in this, the best moments in those films are when Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston are getting to act opposite each other, and the way they can play off of each other is just, it's awesome. It's a great dynamic that they've managed to kind of capture between the two of them.
And not to go off on kind of like a side tangent, but that their chemistry shows you what you can do when you're willing to work together for this common goal, and there's no ego involved, which is ironic because each of the guys they're playing are known to have a little bit of an ego in their own right, but they're so good at doing this and putting aside anything because they know the better each of them are, the better the overall product is, and the better off they both are, that it winds up probably being the most fun. And it's not necessarily the best overall, that's certainly an opinionated question, but I never have more fun during those movies watching two characters interact than I do with those two.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, there's plenty to enjoy about all three of those movies, and again, The Avengers is kind of an independent beast. I mean, it's the culmination of a couple of years of cinematic building, and as Mark Radulich just pointed out, he doesn't view it as a film in the traditional sense, and I can understand where he's coming from with that point. And there's plenty to enjoy about it, but something about when those two are able to be on screen together, it's uncanny, and it's just so much fun. So do you have a favorite Loki moment, comics or film that you feel just, if you were to introduce someone to the character and you had this, 2 pages or this 3-minute scene or whatnot, is there anything that you feel kind of encapsulates the character?
I think the best overall depiction of Loki that you'll see is from a storyline called Acts of Vengeance. That it was one of the first major crossovers that spanned several titles that either Marvel or DC had attempted, and obviously this was done by Marvel. Acts of Vengeance saw a union underneath the guise of a stranger who reached out to kind of all the major player villains at the time. He reached out to Dr. Doom, Magneto, the Red Skull, the Mandarin, the Kingpin, and he convinces them that their problem, why they've never been able to actually win their fights against their adversaries, is because they're too familiar, and what they need to do is switch things up. And the guy manipulating the events is, of course, Loki. And his goal during this is to kind of go back in time almost and erase what he did by forming the Avengers. And so he gets these arch villains, these master villains, to agree to switch opponents off. So you have things like Dr. Doom encountering the Punisher, the Mandarin facing the X-Men, and weird mix-ups of that nature. He engineers a jailbreak at the vault so that these, the henchman-level villains are able to provide an army for these guys he's put into place. But again, this is Loki in all of his glory because it's still going back to his rivalry with his brother, which is how the Avengers were formed. It's him trying to undo something he did that bit him on the behind, which is a recurring thing Loki does, by trying to break the Avengers apart into chaos. And it shows when Loki's at his best, when he's the master manipulator behind the scenes. And this isn't an instance where he's taking, some convict and giving them magical powers just to annoy his brother. He's taking major players and uniting them, for the most part, under his watch and following his orders. And that's the beauty of Loki, is that he's always at his best when he's the puppet master sitting back and watching and admiring his own work.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. When he's able to just kind of be the shadow in the darkness, the man behind the throne, it's whatever, he's so much more interesting than when he has to necessarily be on the front lines. Which is not to say he can't have fun there, too. I mean, I still get a kick out of the fact that he's able to fool people with magical illusions of himself. And, I mean, that's one of my, again, from the Avengers, when he tricks Thor into jumping into the cage made for the Hulk. He jumps through the illusion. He comes walking around the side and looks at Thor and goes, "Are you ever not going to fall for that?" And it's just, it's not just the perfect kind of arrogant thing to say, but it makes sense considering, that these two have grown up together, given their history, that he's probably fallen for that multiple times, and Loki's just never going to let him forget it, including apparently falling for it again at the end of the second one.
Yeah, and Loki has certain characteristics. Like we said, he's kind of a villain maker, in that he creates situations really just out of his own amusement to annoy his brother, and that's how we got kind of the lesser members of Thor's rogues gallery, who are kind of just guys he just beats up, like the Wrecking Crew, who was a villain that started with the villain the Wrecker, and what Loki did was gave him an enchanted crowbar to fight Thor's hammer with. He created the Absorbing Man, a guy named Crusher Creel, who was a convict, and Loki gave him the ability to touch and absorb the physical properties of whatever he touched and engage in a fight with that. And he's come up and he's manipulated other villains who are already around, but just got into his cause. And he's gone so far as to manipulate the big bads of the Marvel Universe and just did it, again, for his own ends and own means. And he's such a great character, because it's not as though he deliberately does this because he enjoys it. He does it really because he has to. He is the god of mischief. There is just a tick inside of him that no matter what he does, he will never overcome, because he has a role to play in their grand scheme of things, and that's what it is. He's there to cause mischief and chaos and bother people and annoy them and just ultimately upset things.
Yeah, he's like you said, he almost can't help it. And if you actually get into the mythology of it, he's the one who, if anyone who knows Norse mythology, he's responsible for the death of Balder, which is kind of a big deal. And it winds up going that way simply because, there's a prophecy that comes down that there's going to, Balder's going to die. And everyone loves Balder, except Loki apparently. So Balder's mother goes to every creature, every mineral, every plant, every ant, everything, and extracts a solemn vow from them that they will not hurt Balder, which manifests itself in humorous ways, because after she's gone through all this effort and now he can't be harmed by anything, the Norse gods celebrate by standing him up and throwing stuff at him, which can't hurt him because of, again, spiritual vow. It's mythology, folks. I didn't write it. But nothing can hurt him, and Loki talks with his mother and says, he takes on the guise of someone else, an old woman, goes to her and says, "So, you talked with everyone, huh?" And she goes, "Yeah, everything except mistletoe." At which point he gets an arrow fashioned out of mistletoe and convinces the blind god, I forget who, he convinces a blind god to shoot this arrow at Balder because
I believe it's Hermod. I could be wrong.
I think you're right. That sounds right. His name just escaped me. And he proceeds to throw this spear made of mistletoe wood, and it kills Balder, and everyone is sad, and they wind up chaining Loki to the rocks underground, and that's where he remains until Ragnarok comes, and that's strict mythology. But just the point there being, she almost it was tempting fate, like, okay, I'm going to get everything, and Loki just looked, you didn't get everything, and now I'm compelled to do something with it. And it's a really kind of almost sad character trait, because you see, on the occasion that he tries to do good or is unselfish, he's just such a powerful force that if he were on the side of good, you can just imagine what he would accomplish. And it wouldn't be nearly as fun, mind you, but that's not the point. He could just be a force for good, and he winds up being the opposite.
Yeah, and just to give you an example, during the storyline Siege, where Norman Osborn decides to raise Asgard and the world because he's nearing the end of his rope and decides he has to make a grand move to try to set things his way, Loki manipulated those events too by a large extent. And when he sees what's actually going on and realizing how much destruction he's causing and what the potential for the worst is, he sacrifices himself and uses the Norn Stones of Legend to empower the heroes so they have a fighting chance. And by doing that, he ultimately gives them enough ammunition to win and beat Osborn and his forces, and does so at the cost of what appears at the time to be his life.
Isn't it the Void that winds up killing him?
Yeah, and there's, that's a whole other can of worms, because essentially we hate
yes.
for all the wrong reasons.
Yes.
But he ends up, the Void, who is the dark persona of the Sentry, winds up being the one who kills Loki, and that just enrages Thor, who's not enchanted by the Norn Stones, into the fight with the Sentry, and Thor eventually just keeps lamenting over the loss of his brother, because anybody who has a sibling will understand this. No matter what they do or screw up or how bad you dislike them, nobody's allowed to do anything to them but you, because it's your brother or it's your sister. And that's kind of the root matter of the relationship in a lot of ways between Thor and Loki. And you see that played out in the Avengers too, where, you know, Iron Man and Captain America and S.H.I.E.L.D. have Loki in custody in their jet, and Thor's like, well, this ain't happening. He's my brother. He's coming with me.
Yeah. And he even stands up for him when they're on the helicarrier, and everyone's mentioning all the, the things he's done, and Thor kind of, watch yourself. Thor, Loki's, he may not, he may be a little off, but he's still Asgardian. He's still my brother, and it's a really interesting relationship that those two have. But you brought up a couple of the lesser ones, and we may as well kind of hit those since we've brought them up already, in the form of the Wrecking Crew and the Absorbing Man. And these are, admittedly lesser entries into the Rogues Gallery. We're kind of on the B team here, if not C, when you get into some of the other members of the Wrecking Crew. But so just, kind of your, well, as far as the Wrecking Crew goes, isn't the Wrecker, the guy with the crowbar, he's the only one who's, like, actually Asgardian enchanted, and again, Loki just gave him the crowbar because, hey, look, magic crowbar, it'll fight the hammer, right?
Yeah, and what ended up happening was the Wrecker was the original member of, before there was a Wrecking Crew, there was the Wrecker. And what happened was he, as we said, he was given this enchanted weapon by Loki in order to combat Thor, this enchanted crowbar, and he basically was a felon and an armed robber prior to this, using the alias and name of the Wrecker. Loki got knocked out by him and put on Loki's helmet, and the helmet itself gets enchanted by Karnilla, Queen of the Norns, and it was meant for Loki, and he now gets super strength and stamina, which allows him to fight against Thor. And Loki just ends up manipulating him over and over again. And what happened was he ended up taking this enchantment and found a way to share it with 3 of his buddies who he used to work construction with. And what happened was he kind of just, I think they didn't write it well. I think it was something like they struck the crowbar with lightning, and it would allowed him to share it with who would become his 3 partners: Thunderball, who carries a big old wrecking ball on a chain; Bulldozer, who, as his name implies, runs at things and knocks them down; and Pile Driver, who's just a really strong guy who likes to pound things.
Who is also banned in WWE right now.
And Lucha Libre.
Really? Everyone's banning the Pile Driver. Jeez.
Yeah, it's a big no-no in Mexico. You get fined by the Athletic Commission if you do it.
Alrighty.
But yeah, there's them, and then there's the Absorbing Man who you brought up. That's who.
Nick Nolte. Come on.
Let's just
ignore
that.
I can annoy almost any comic book fan on the planet by bringing up Ang Lee's version Hulk.
And I like the movie for the most part, but
their version of the Absorbing Man and his powers was not good. It was hokey in the extreme, and Nick Nolte's a fine actor. Hey, look, I can turn into... No, it was just a poorly conceived and executed version of that character, which is kind of sad because Absorbing Man makes a pretty decent Hulk since he just absorbs Hulk's power and Hulk just gets madder. Yeah,
and in a lot of ways, he's arguably the best human adversary that Thor has because he's been around for so long, because he always poses a serious threat due to his abilities. Crusher Creel is a guy who is an ex-con, just wants to break out. Loki uses him as a pawn and enchants him to get a power where he's able to touch something and absorb its physical properties and use them. And Jesse Starcher playing the home game has reminded us of the awful Nick Nolte version. Thank you, Jesse. But
behold the CGI.
Some of the writers have actually really explored kind of the length at which Creel's powers can go, and they've had him do things like absorb the properties of Thor's hammer to use against him, which is a huge thing because Thor's fighting his own power. and there's the great comic cover of, I believe it's the Absorbing Man's first appearance, where he's swinging his wrecking ball, Thor swinging his hammer into the wrecking ball, and it's the title, I believe, is The Harder I Fight, the Faster I Die, which was outstanding and one of the gems of the Lee Kirby era. But because he's so powerful, it always poses a threat. And when he's paired off with a Loki, it makes it even greater because now there's a brain to guide that, very powerful body.
Yeah, I'm not as up on the comics as a lot of other people. My primary memory of the Absorbing Man and absorbing some of the powers of Mjolnir actually comes from the cartoon Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and he absorbs power from Mjolnir, and a bit later he's seen kind of wailing on Thor, and he's saying, "Why aren't you fighting back?" And Thor's like, "I'm concentrating." At which point he then is able to control the Absorbing Man because the power of Mjolnir is only Thor's to control, not anyone else's, and he then hurls him across the planet, something like that.
Yeah, straight out of Gamma World. But that was a pretty decent portrayal of the Absorbing Man, I thought, and kind of how dangerous he can be. And again, like any character, it's all about what writers you have, manipulating this character. And when he's used right, he makes for a great villain because he's that big physical presence that can actually threaten Thor and do a lot of damage.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, as far as humans go, human threats to Thor, given his Asgardian heritage and everything, it's kind of a short list. And he, if he was like I said, when he's paired with Loki or someone with a brain, then it's about to get real because you pair that kind of brawn with an intelligence and you've got something going. Okay, since we talked about Loki, who was in both Thor movies, let's just go ahead and hit the kind of the major villain, I suppose you could say, from Thor 2, The Dark World, and that's the Dark Elves, in particular Malekith, and one of the Cursed, that's Cursed with a K, to differentiate them from the others of the Dark Elf race. Who was it? Christopher Eccleston, who was Malekith? Too much makeup on for me to recognize off the top of my head. That's it. I felt that was an interesting story played out in the movie. Is that where does that come from in the comics, or was that was just an amalgamation, or how did that come about? Because I have no knowledge of that on that particular subject.
Well, Malekith, for a lot of ways, is similar to his comic portrayal. His motives are different. Malekith is introduced into the series in the 80s by Walt Simonson, and what he does is he strikes a deal with Loki. And he does so as an emissary of Surtur, who I'm sure we'll get to at a certain point fairly soon.
Oh, yes.
And what happens is Malekith kills the Guardian of the Casket of Ancient Winters, which is the artifact that Loki has in the first movie. And since they used it in that movie, they couldn't redo it in the second movie, so they changed it to the movie-originated ether. And
it's one of the Infinity Gems, right?
Of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So Malekith causes this distraction by doing that. He uses Thor's girlfriend as bait and fights Thor to battle his follower, Algrim the Strong, who in the movie becomes cursed. Now, Algrim in the movie is different than Algrim in the comics because they couldn't incorporate his true origin. In the comic books, Algrim becomes the being cursed due to the machinations of the character The Beyonder, who is responsible for the Secret Wars storyline and just really would not have fit into what they're trying to do. They're
having a tough time doing Thanos properly, so let's not get into the Beyonder.
Yeah, in the comics, the abilities Curse has, and we're going off a little bit on Curse, but he's a pretty essential part of Malekith's introduction. Because of the augmentation by the Beyonder, he was originally kind of a close match in physical strength and prowess to Thor. Then the Beyonder decides, I'm going to double Thor's strength in this guy, and what the heck of it, let's make it 4 times as strong. He got armor that made him almost totally invulnerable, but like all the Dark Elves, he's still vulnerable to iron, and that's the big Achilles heel of the Dark Elf race. Malekith is a very powerful magical entity who he's almost as good at doing what Loki does, just a little bit behind him. It's like, the best analogy I can make is for wrestling fans who are a large percentage of our audience. If you couldn't book Terry Funk to wrestle your show, you booked Dick Slater. Because Dick Slater could do everything that Terry Funk could do it spot on, and entertain people. But the thing is, it wasn't Terry Funk, it was Dick Slater. And that's kind of where Malekith is. Malekith is a manipulator, just like Loki. He relies heavily on magic, and he's actually around in the comics now, and what he's doing is collecting the rings of the Mandarin, which should make for something interesting. But Malekith, his biggest thing that he's accomplished so far was he destroyed the Casket of Ancient Winters, pretty much bringing about an ice age on Earth and almost destroyed the planet. But Thor, of course, being Thor, was able to stop the scheme in play and beat him and punish him. But now Malekith's portrayal in the movie was good. I just wish they kind of would have given him a little more depth, because they made him menacing, and you weren't always convinced as to why.
Yeah, I can see that. And Christopher Eccleston's a fine actor. He did a good job as far as that goes. I mean, he wound up having a heavy prosthetic job, and didn't they alter his voice? I think it was somehow digitally enhanced.
Without a doubt.
Okay. It just didn't sound like he had in the past. I mean, tonal qualities that you can't make as a human that you have to do through some form of digital manipulation. But you brought up Surtur, and let's go ahead and tackle him right now then. And okay, a little discourse on Norse mythology. Surtur was like king of the fire giants, and in Norse mythology there are different giants. You have fire giants, ice giants, hill giants. Oh, there might have been a fourth, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And of all of them, fire giants are kind of the nastiest. And Surtur was their king. He's like the ancient force that has always kind of opposed Odin. And he's actually the one who, I believe Odin is destined to die fighting during Ragnarok. Don't hold me to that, though, anybody out there. But he's a big deal. I mean, he's actually the, I forget the terminology, but he's the, now I'm going to feel really stupid because he's the symbol for the the motorcycle club, the Pagans, who are, last I checked at least, they're a northeastern outlaw motorcycle gang, terminology.
The second biggest in the area.
Yeah, and he's, so there's that's a pretty substantial, there's a lot of history there, and then you bring him into the comics, and he's still a big deal, but yeah, so how does he play in the comics? And I hope we get to see him on screen at some point, because again, Surtur, he's awesome. But so, how does he play for you? Well,
in Norse mythology, the big deal with Surtur is the one who's fated to swing his flaming sword across the 9 realms and end the universe as it is. And in the Thor comic mythology, in Marvel Comics, they tell him that he's waiting they say that he's waiting at the end of time where he can kill men and gods. And you find out that he has a big rivalry with Odin, because Odin at one point imprisoned him inside the earth after Odin allied himself with trolls, and he just forms this grudge against Odin for that affront to him as he sees it. He's first brought out by Loki, who wants to usurp Odin and, of course, take over the throne. And he invades Earth with another giant, a storm giant named Skag. And so Odin, Thor, and Balder have to battle them. And what Odin does, using his power, is he stops time and basically kind of gets every person on the Earth off of it and puts them into like a little pocket dimension. Basically, he can do anything he wants against seemingly anybody, with the exception of whoever carries the Odin Force, which is the only real way to combat Surtur. He flings Thor away as though he's nothing, does the same thing to Balder, and until Thor is able to use Odin's sword, he really has no answer for what Surtur can do to him, and he uses the sword to trap him on a meteorite where Odin uses particles on it to send him into another galaxy. But Surtur really gets, portrayed as the big deal that he is, again, by who else? Walt Simonson, the guy who really made Thor the book that it's become. And he has the blade, which is called Twilight, that he's eventually fated to use to destroy the universe. And he's going to fulfill the prophecy while Loki takes control of the throne for a short time. What happens is Loki realizes that, oh, wait, he's going to end the world that I rule right now. So he has to ponder, is it better to be king and die, or do I want another shot at this without this happening? So Loki eventually sides with Thor and Odin when Odin makes his return, and Odin winds up absorbing Surtur because he can't figure out what else to do with him. Surtur eventually gains enough power to rebuild his physical body, and he just starts wrecking Asgard until the big moment when Thor, who's taken on the Odin Force, banishes Surtur into something called the Sea of Eternal Night, where he just wasn't seen for years afterwards.
Yeah, he's a pretty big deal. I mean, and I really kind of hope that they, in the next Thor movie, assuming there is one, that they bring him out and kind of let him around to play, because he's, I don't want to say he's the last.
He's Armageddon.
He is. He's the end of the world. I mean, he shows up and, his stated purpose, his existence, is there so that he can end life as it exists in the universe. I mean, kind of hard to get bigger than that.
He's the literal representation of Armageddon as originally told by the Prose Edda, and into the Marvel Comics, universe, he's it. He's going to end the world at some point, as he stated to, and even the way he's visualized by the artist, he's over 1,000 feet tall. He can do pretty much whatever he wants. There's nobody other than, getting into real cosmic levels of power that can even stand up to him, let alone try to combat what he's doing. He's as big bad gets.
Well, maybe. Yeah. I'm almost kind of sad that they're going to wind up going. Indications are that Thanos will be the third Avengers movie, because you could do him, and that would be awesome. But you've introduced Thanos, you got to get to him. And I know Thanos is kind of he's more than just any one. He's a threat to the entire Marvel universe as opposed to one, hero in particular. But Thor's the only guy who's kind of solo gone up against him with any appreciable degree of success. I mean, everyone else, it winds up being, well, we have to team up, and there has to be, no one-on-one guy can stand up to Thanos, with the possible exception of Thor under the proper circumstances. And, since we're going to get Thanos to one degree or another in the few of the upcoming Marvel films, let's go ahead and tackle, the big purple Titan.
The best portrayal of a Thor-Thanos matchup was probably done by Dan Jurgens in the second volume of Thor, and it's kind of tough to match them up properly, because there's never been a circumstance where they're on an even setting when it comes to power. The first time they're really portrayed as going up against each other, Thanos, of course, has taken control of the Infinity Gems, and Thor is at arguably his all-time weakest, because he's in the version where he shared a body with Eric Masterson, as opposed to the actual essence of Thor and his being. It was Eric Masterson who gained a certain level of Thor's powers, but not all of them. You go a little bit later on when Thor is his regular self again, and he's been stricken with Warrior's Madness, which increases his power to a startling degree. And what happens is he beats up the entire Infinity Watch. He beats up the Silver Surfer. Thanos has to make an alliance with them to try to stop him from destroying everything in his path, and puts him in kind of a stasis field. And he's holding the power gem at the time, as opposed to all of them. But even he acknowledges in that storyline, which I believe is called Blood and Thunder, that as soon as Thor gets out, it's a problem, because he doesn't know if he's going to be able to take him. And then you go further into the Dan Jurgens storyline, and Thor really unleashes things he's never had to do to an opponent when fighting what's perceived to be Thanos, using things such as the God Blast, which is the highest powered, non-lethal weapon he can fire from his hammer, that he uses his hammer as a focal point to concentrate and destroy with. The only thing he stops short of using is something called the Anti-Force, I believe is the name of it, where he can destroy whatever in his path with it if he unleashes its full potential. So it's always been interesting, because there's always been some kind of extenuating circumstance, and comic one-on-one fights is the biggest debate within comics. Who takes who? Does this guy beat that guy? Who ends up? And Thor and Thanos is always going to be one of those fights that people will debate until we actually see it happen on even terms.
Neither guy has beat the other clean. That's kind of what you're saying.
It's always ended in a disqualification, a count-out, or somebody runs in and interferes with a foreign object to put the other guy over.
Okay, now just as a brief, to anyone who doesn't, I have a hard time imagining, if you listen to this, you're not terribly familiar with Thanos, but Thanos is a he's a member of the Eternals, if memory serves, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But he's afflicted with this.
I don't believe he's an Eternal. It may have been changed, but I do know that he's of Titan, the Titan, which is, I think it's one of the moons surrounding Saturn.
Yeah,
he may be an Eternal because I think they've classified his brother Star Fox as an Eternal, but they've been kind of ambiguous about that.
Okay, here it is. He's born to the Eternals, but he's carrying what's called the Deviance gene, which is why that's why he looks different than the other Eternals. And he is just obsessed with death. I mean, to the point where his name, Thanos, is actually the Greek god of death. And no, it's not Hades. Hades ruled the underworld. Thanos was actually death. Well, Thanatos, if you want to get technical. So, but again, I mean, to this day...
And he's a nihilist, which the Big Lebowski would appreciate.
I appreciate it.
Sam the Eagle, ladies and gentlemen.
But yeah, his goal is to court death, and after he gets the Infinity Gems, he wipes out half or the staggering percentage of the population of the universe because he just wishes to impress death. Okay, here, take half of all things in the universe. It's kind of staggering when you consider the amount of destruction that he's caused. And he's appropriately 9 times out of 10 opposed by at least 3 people. Because, again, Thor's the only guy who, to date, we've seen go one-on-one and have anything approaching success under various extenuating circumstances. And so I'm really hoping that they'll get Thanos done properly when they finally get around to doing his Avengers movie. And how he might appear in Guardians of the Galaxy might be interesting, even though I'm so torn on that film. But that's a completely different podcast. I don't think we can dovetail the Collector into a Thor discussion, can we?
No, and I think we'd be better off not doing it.
Reaching too much. Okay. Well, the other main one that you see portrayed a fair amount that actually the MCU has not touched on yet as far as Thor villains goes, and that's Amora the Enchantress.
And don't remind me that they haven't touched on her yet. It's so disappointing.
I agree. I mean, a little, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in any of this character biography, but she is an Asgardian who winds up making a deal with Loki. He teaches her magic, and she actually becomes very skilled in the mystical arts. She falls in love with Thor, and he has no interest whatsoever, and she kind of becomes, she starts off, from what I could tell, kind of like Harley Quinn to Loki's Joker, but her character and what she's able to accomplish are handled so much better that at this point in time the second Enchantress at this point, but again, the Enchantress character is on her own a legitimate threat to Thor and pretty much anyone else she chooses to tangle with. Am I wrong in any of that? Feel free to correct me.
No, she's a fantastic character. And listen, Marvel, Kevin Feige, if you're listening, cast Kate Upton to play the Enchantress in a movie. You really cannot go wrong with that combination.
Can she act?
Amora is... What's that?
Is Kate Upton good for any legitimate acting?
Who cares? You're not... This is why she's perfect, because you will look at her and be spellbound and not care. And that's the Enchantress, and that's why it's perfect.
I will defer to your judgment on that.
Amora, she served as kind of a thrall to Loki. She's studied under Carnilla to really master magic and kind of has a potent magic use of her own at a certain point where she really doesn't need either of them. She's a founding member of the primary Avengers Nemesis group, the Masters of Evil, mainly because she wants a shot at Thor. And if he's not going to love her, then she's going to destroy him one way or the other. You can't exist without loving me. And she's a fantastic character because she's in kind of the purest essence exactly what a man who's not pussy-whipped will do to a woman. A woman who's used to having anything she wants from anybody at any time with this sense of entitlement, walking around like her shit doesn't stink. And yet there's that one guy, perfect analogy. And yet there's that one guy, which in this case would be a UFC championship if we're talking Uriah Faber, that will always elude her, and she cannot deal with that fact or accept it because it's all she wants, and she can't have it, So she's going to destroy it if she can't have it. And in a lot of instances, there becomes the question of, what is, is it more than just lust with her? Does she really love Thor? Because there's been instances where Thor's been in some deep trouble, and she has abandoned her plot to save him or to aid him in a lot of instances. And even going back to the Secret Wars storyline, the Enchantress is one of the villains who's taken on to the planet Battleworld by the Beyonder to stay on the villain side, and eventually becomes the happiest person in the world because she convinces Thor, like, listen, we're not to be pawns of somebody. We're gods. We're above this. Let's get out of here, just me and you, and we'll figure out a way to go home and avoid this whole thing. And Thor finally says, this is the sanest thing you've ever said to me. I agree. Let's work together on this, and we can do something and get home. And there's been brief moments where she's had Thor in her thrall, and willingly. And probably it was in the mid-'90s when the Thor book was really kind of not very good, and they were experimenting with a different costume every year for him and trying to tie in the mythology but screwing it up. And what happened was Thor at one point was depowered, had nothing. So the Enchantress takes him in because she's living in a very luxurious loft in Manhattan. And the two of them just wind up living together and kind of casually sleeping together. And if it's a soap opera, it's great, but as a comic, it didn't really read all that well. And much like any hot girl who's always after one guy that she can't have, she has a willing dummy slave at all costs named the Executioner, Scourge. And poor Scourge is so smitten and so in love with the Enchantress that he's willing to do anything. And if that means getting rid of Thor, so be it, because then he doesn't have to worry about her having this affection for him, and he's still there, so she's got to choose me then at that point, right? Well, poor Scourge is, a great physical equal to Thor, in many ways kind of an Asgardian absorbing man in being a physical foe. Thor does have an edge over, but can still be troubled by. And over the years, just does whatever Amora says, till finally he kind of has this realization that, wow, she really doesn't care about me. And it's during what could have been Ragnarok. There's a point where somebody has to hold back the forces of hell, and Scourge volunteers to be the guy to hold them back. And in a real touching kind of moment, he sacrifices himself to the greater good. And when the Enchantress is told about what he did, she cries because she understands that she manipulated and used this guy, and deep down, she really did care about him to an extent. And it was really, really afraid, and it was really, really afraid of what her life was going to be like without him, and didn't know what to do. And it was almost touching, but not soon after, she resumed her villainous ways, as any villain will do and any woman will do. Listening, guys, any woman will do that.
Well, I assume we don't have a lot, so go ahead and be chauvinistic if you feel so. I don't know. Doesn't she try to get him brought back at one point?
She tries to strike a deal to resurrect him, and at a great cost of herself, which is actually a fairly nice selfless act in some ways. Of course, the fact that she's manipulating black magic to do it is not the nicest thing to say about her. But she's had selfless acts, and that's why it's kind of tough to classify her as solely a villain. I mean, in her initial appearances to the 60s, 70s, and into the early part of the 80s, absolutely she's a villain. She does nothing but wrong, even though she claims to love Thor. But as they developed some depth with her and used her a lot more as a character, she's kind of just almost like an obsessive female fan who doesn't know what to do with herself. Kind of just like the hottest Thor groupie ever. And she eventually comes close, but she never grabs that brass ring and makes Thor hers. And it's brought her into conflict with some of Thor's allies, like, of course, Sif, who is one of Thor's, many lady friends, and in the midst, of course, is his wife. It's had her go after Thor's mortal love, Jane Foster, on several occasions. And at those times, you can see the villainous nature in its full effect. But the fact that she's so devoted to the guy and is willing to kind of come back from these bad things and help him, it almost makes you root for her a little bit, that maybe one day she will walk the straight and narrow. But she's a lot more fun when she doesn't, and she's a terrific character. And she could potentially, if written the right way, be a primary villain of a Thor movie. There's not a question in my mind about it, and I would like to see her in that role as opposed to being relegated to like a second fiddle. But either way, I just want to see her brought out into the movies. and I would particularly want to see her played by Kate Upton.
Alrighty. Okay, the other Asgardian, I don't even know if you'd necessarily qualify this as a villain in the traditional sense, but the last thing I kind of want to talk about as far as Asgardians go, and then we'll maybe do just a brief wrap-up of anything else that kind of comes to mind. The Destroyer, which is actually, now correct me if I'm wrong, but in the comics it's just incredibly powerful and enchanted armor that it doesn't do anything until it is possessed or controlled by some kind of the sentient spirit of a living being, which essentially makes it a weapon as opposed to a villain. And then the film turned it into a semi-thinking automaton and kind of went from there. But, anything that's as powerful as that suit of armor happens to be, it's got to be worth mentioning.
Yeah, the Destroyer, as it's based in the comics, what it is it's a suit of armor built by Odin. And what it was eventually revealed to be was that Odin had built it as armor for himself to channel his energy into to fight the Celestials. What it was actually hidden on Earth in what's called the Temple of Darkness in Asia. And, of course, the manipulating force behind the majority of the Destroyer's appearances has been Loki. And what happens is, what Loki does is subverts humans or other living beings and uses them to animate the Destroyer. And the Destroyer, as its name implies, has a base, almost programming to seek and destroy. And it's eventually going to corrupt the host unless it's like a level of real supreme power like an Odin who can use it without being corrupted by it and losing himself into the armor. And what it is it's not subject to physical fatigue. It'll use all your power at like an endless cycle to do and destroy whatever's in front of it. And the biggest power it has, which it's shown in the movies, is it can fire beams out of what are essentially its eye holes in the armor and use them to disintegrate whatever's in front of it and destroy matter, which, if you know anything about physics, matter cannot be created or destroyed except by this thing. So it's got enough power to alter the laws of the universe. The armor itself doesn't have anything that you can really do to stop it, and when it does can corrupt the life force that's inhabiting it, it'll eventually kill its host body. So only real supremely strong beings have been able to stand up to it. And even Thor has had times where he couldn't do it alone. The Destroyer at times has actually cracked Mjolnir, and Thor's had to have it repaired by mystic means. He's used to try to just not even distract Thor. This is when Loki was really on the edge and wanted to actually just kill him to have him out of the way. And this was what he sought to use. The Destroyer eventually is considered such a useful tool that it's used to substitute as a herald of Galactus and served Galactus for years as an animated power cosmic level being until Loki finally steals it, for lack of a better word. It's just a conduit almost for limitless power, and it's probably the biggest moment the Destroyer host in terms of its use of power has ever seen. When the Celestials were going to fight the Sky Fathers, who are Odin, Zeus, they're all the heads of the pantheons of godhood. It's the fourth host is the big Celestial that's going to destroy them. So at the big moment, Odin channels himself into the Destroyer armor and absorbs all the life essence of everybody in Asgard, except for Thor, who wasn't there at the time. The Destroyer grows to about 2,000 feet, draws the Odin sword, which is Odin's answer to Surtur's world-ending sword, and confronts the fourth host. And it almost beats it. And considering that the Celestials are unbeatable, that's pretty impressive. And that's the only time you've ever seen the Destroyer armor broken is by a fourth host of a Celestial, which says a ridiculous amount about just how powerful it is. It's not so much a villain itself as its use is villainous. And, of course, when the manipulating force behind it is usually Loki, the intent becomes very serious, and it's much more used as a force of destruction rather than a tool of protection.
Yeah, I agree. And I just reading the Wikipedia page about some of the things that the Destroyer's armor has endured and persevered through. It's mind-boggling when all things are put into their proper context. Jesse Starcher has requested that we touch on Gore the God Butcher, and I have absolutely no knowledge of this particular entity. Hadn't stumbled across it before. I assume because of that it's a relatively new entry into the universe of Thor, so I'm going to be kind of learning on the fly as you go through, as you kind of give me the breakdown. What's up with Gore the God Butcher, Pat?
Thor the God Butcher was in the relaunch of Thor series written by Jason Aaron. Really great villain to finally come along in a long time. Basically, Gore is an alien whose people, and specifically his immediate family, were killed during the battle of the gods on his native planet. And he just couldn't understand how beings that called themselves, gods, who were supposed to be the guardians of the people, could allow this to happen. And so he dedicates his life to destroying anyone or anything labeled a god. And with each god he murders, he becomes more powerful, absorbing their just godly essence into himself. And what happens is our present version of Thor knows this God Butcher because a younger version of Thor had come across him and sort of defeated him, but not really. And the God Butcher just develops this weapon that's going to destroy any living being, god, otherwise. And Thor is just at the end of his rope. He's not sure what to do. The God Butcher is so destructive that Thor has to team up with his younger self, plucked from out of time, and his older self, who's referred to as King Thor, who very much resembles Odin and, has one eye that he sacrificed for knowledge, much like Odin. He's missing an arm that's been replaced by one of the Destroyer's arms, and it takes 3 versions of Thor, one of which is in possession of the Odin Force, obviously then called the Thor Force, since he's in control of it, to take out the God Butcher and end his madness of killing gods. But the best way to say it is he's a serial killer of gods. So anybody who's a fan of your more mentally unstable, bloodthirsty, murderous characters, Mark Radlich, I'm looking at you, Jason Teasley, I'm looking at you. This is a character who's made for their mindset, but can be effective in a way that those guys can't against a being as powerful as Thor. And I don't know that we've seen the last of the God Butcher. The arc was designed to really kind of wake people up and show them how Thor can react to such a being and reintroduce the series with a real, oomph to it. And I think he's the best character that you've seen created for Thor in about 30 years. It was really a great arc. I had rated it as definitely one of the top 5 Thor story arcs you'll ever read. And just a phenomenal character with a lot of potential for future badassery.
I'm always down for, bloodthirsty serial killer maniacs. I enjoy, those story arcs. Hey, guess what I do in my spare time? I have a podcast called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. Naturally, it would be all right. I'm going to have to look that up now because you've sold me on it. So it took 3... That's kind of crazy that it would take 3 versions of Thor, including one wielding the Thor Force. I mean, that's granted an amped up version, but it's kind of the same thing as the only thing that beats Superman is an alternate version of Super. Well, Thor can't stop this guy, so we need 2 other Thors, and one of them supremely powerful, and then we can. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, I'm gonna look that up when I get a chance now. So. Thank you to both. I mean, you both brought it up, so thank you to Pat for enlightening me, and thank you to Jesse Starcher for the pretty cool picture actually that he put up there. So I'll be checking that out. Let's see, was there any other? There's a couple more kind of almost lighthearted ones I think that I want to get into. Are there any other serious ones that we haven't touched on, Pat, that spring to your mind?
We've gotten the real serious big bads out of the way for Thor. We've kind of gone through his 8-player list. There's Ymir the Frost Giant, who is kind of like a frozen version of Surtur, but not anywhere near as powerful and is not really portrayed as his biggest threat. Magog is probably the big one that we missed, but it's really he's a powerful character because he's fueled by hate, and as long as there's hate in the universe, he has power. And he holds a forever grudge against Odin, but he's not a particularly well-written character, and he's not used well. So I kind of don't think of him as a real big deal. And I guess there's Ulik the Troll, who's a good physical adversary, who's almost as strong as Thor, but again, it's kind of one of those guys who you just want to read a fun Thor beat-em-up story. Ulik is used.
All right. The only other thing that I feel is somewhat relevant would probably be Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. And for those of you not familiar with Norse mythology, I believe the Jormungand serpent is actually one of the children of Loki. He has 3. He has Hela, who is half dead and rules the underworld. He has the Fenris wolf, and he has the Jormungand serpent, which is so big it actually encircles the world. And it will be freed when Ragnarok comes about, and it and Thor will kill each other. And again, Ragnarok is the end of the world. But this giant snake and Thor kill each other, and that's how Thor's life actually comes to an end.
Yeah, that's the fated cycle of Ragnarok, where the final battle between the two will see Thor finally strike a killing blow to the serpent, but having fought the serpent for so long and being exposed to the venom as much as he was, eventually what happens is he's poisoned and he collapses after taking his final steps and dies.
So right off the bat, you have a reason where anytime the Midgard serpent, Jormungand, shows up, there's a big cause for concern because of the prophecies involved. And eventually it's revealed that there's another serpent who was Odin's brother and was banished from Asgard, and he comes to wreak havoc on the earth, and Thor is fated to die. Apparently the prophecy has been written so that Thor is fated to die in battle against that serpent. That was part of the Fear Itself storyline, which I wasn't a tremendous fan of. It allowed, some fun fights where there were alternate hammers created that took over other people, but it really wasn't very well written, and it was just an excuse to make money. So I don't really like to talk about that version of the serpent so much as I do Jormungand, who's the serpent of myth and really the one that everything was based around.
Yeah, it's and I've seen a couple of the comic covers, and I mean, considering the fact that this thing stretches all the way around the world, even then it's huge. I mean, the thing is monstrous.
It literally encircles the world. You can't really get a whole lot bigger than that. And there was a point in time where Thor his body had been broken due to a curse, and he was still powerful, but his bones were brittle, so he had to wear a knightly-looking suit of armor that was a low point costume-wise for most of us fans, but it did allow for a good story usage where Thor had to battle the serpent in that form, and because they had been toying around with the idea of replacement Thors in the storyline, you weren't sure if he was going to make it, because that's a threat that the serpent possesses, and it's fated. And one thing about the Asgardians is their fate is their everything. It's written, it will come to pass. There is no such thing as denying it or getting out of it. So you always had to be on the edge of your seat when he showed up. And again, Walt Simonson, surprise, surprise, I'll reference him. He was a guy who really kind of gave even depth to the serpent, where the serpent can speak and taunts Thor about how, I'm going to go, but I'm going to get you, and that's going to break your heart a lot more than it's going to break mine.
Well, you gotta love the malicious serpent. I mean, I maintain that snakes have a bad rap by and large, which is ironic considering that, I mean, for as much as the kind of Judeo-Christian mythology,
symbolism.
I say mythology. I don't mean to insult anyone's beliefs out there, including some that fall under my category. I use it as a phrase because I believe it to be an accurate one, not as anything dismissive. The serpent is portrayed as evil. It's the symbol of Satan. Which is actually not accurate at all in the sense that snakes are also the symbols of healers and doctors. I mean, if you read the Bible, I believe Christ is referred to as a serpent. To this day, the symbol on ambulances or for paramedics is 2 snakes winding around the staff of Hermes, I believe. Now, if you're going to get deep into fun mythological allusions, so. But by the same token, it's always fun to have one that'll just kind of snarkily and maliciously snipe at you. Okay, but since we're kind of one of the more lighthearted, I say lighthearted. That's in some cases it's a relevant term, relative term. Thor has kind of a fun rivalry with Hercules, which bugs me because it should be Heracles, since this is the Greek version as opposed to the Roman version, but I digress. I'm kind of a perfectionist.
Blame Italian film studios and Steve Reeves for that.
I will. It's for anyone who doesn't know, in the original Greek mythology, the character that we know as Hercules is actually named Heracles, which is a reference to his ongoing issues with Hera, who is Zeus's wife, and she doesn't like Hercules for a variety of reasons. And initially, anyway, in Greek it's Heracles. In the Romans adapted it, and it became Hercules, and that's just kind of how things have progressed. But he and Thor get into it every now and then, as somewhat egomaniacal deities are wont to do, I suppose. I mean, I think it's Hercules that has the great line about Thor hitting him so hard he landed in a place the gods forgot, which just happened to be New Jersey.
Their rivalry just is fun to read every time. They've done miniseries based around it, just because the two of them, they're both gods walking around among men, but whenever they're both of them in the same place, it's inevitable that people are going to compare, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm not the alpha male to some people now. I need to fix that, because if you read the mythology, they're both two of the most macho, mythological figures that there's ever been, and it only makes sense that there's going to be this kind of, almost like, again, we'll go back to using a wrestling reference, but when Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar befriended each other in 2003, and there would be all these skits between them with who could do more push-ups, who could chug more milk. Well, you substitute push-ups for arm wrestling, and you substitute milk for mead, and you've got kind of the relationship between Thor and Herc, where they always kind of jab at each other and will eventually exchange fisticuffs at a point. But whenever it gets serious, they refer to each other as blood brothers and always have each other's back when it comes to that. When Hercules' character was killed in Marvel at the end of an event called Chaos War, Thor was the speaker at his funeral that the superheroes held, and exchanged, a couple of stories about how, Hercules bedded this girl, and he got into this girl's pants, and he outdrank this guy, and it had everybody laughing. And there's an issue of Avengers where it's a standalone issue, which was a lot more common in the past than it is today, where a bunch of older kids are in Central Park picking on a kid in a Thor t-shirt, talking about how easily Hercules could beat up Thor, and the little kid's, in tears saying, no way, Thor's the best, and Thor can do anything. And Hercules happens to be walking through the park with the Avengers butler Jarvis and sees this going on, and Herc, being Herc, starts boasting about how, yeah, I beat up Thor, and Jarvis kind of nudges him and points to the little kid crying, and Herc realizes, he's like, oh, man, I can't let this go on. So Herc actually tells a story about how Thor ended up pulling his fat out of the fire to validate the little kid. And again, you get the feeling he wouldn't do that if he didn't respect Thor and have this begrudging rivalry with him. And reading them together, it's like watching a buddy cop movie, with each guy just trying to out-alpha male the other.
Yeah, and Hercules is another interesting character, especially when you get into his mythology. But that's a different podcast, different stories. The other, again, pseudo kind of lighthearted rivalry that Thor has is he and Ares. Again, another Greek version of the Greek gods in comics. You have Ares, god of war. He and Ares and Thor don't especially get along either.
Well, Ares initially was depicted as a villain. He was a henchman basically for Pluto, the god of the underworld, Herc's brother, and kind of a little bit confusing in the mythology that they use for Grecians and Marvel, but that's okay. But Ares was a very regular threat in Thor's books, particularly when Hercules was around, and was depicted as just a guy who was all about causing, as his mythology implies, war, and wanted to take out Thor, who he saw as an opposition to the plan he was involved with. And Ares became a great character when he was written into the new Avengers series by Brian Michael Bendis, and depicted as kind of your badass anti-hero who is taking the role almost of a Thor or a Hercules figure in the Avengers, where you could argue the Century filled Thor's role and Ares filled Hercules' role in that scheme of things. And when that happened, Ares eventually would cross paths with Thor from time to time when Thor came back, and not so much the fun rivalry that Thor and Hercules have, so much as you're a jerk, shut up, you're a jerk, shut up, back and forth like that. And they would fight on the same side, but ultimately you could tell there was really no like between them. This was animosity that had built up over their fights over time, and let's say they may forgive, but they won't necessarily forget.
Yeah, and there are those kind of contentious relationships that, again, what you do with, from a storytelling standpoint, is you take a very human experience and you just amp it up to fit the characters and the setting that you're placing them in. And in this case, it's just kind of acrimonious allies who you can't get along with, but you wind up joining side with from time to time, and you get the sense that eventually at some point they'll probably wind up really throwing down again. But it's a very human type of relationship in that sense. It's just amped up to meet the criteria of, hey, look, we're gods in comic books. All right, I think that's everything I had that I wanted to cover. Is there any other ones that come to your mind? Serious, not so serious, that we haven't touched on so far, Pat?
I guess real briefly we can kind of mention the Hulk in the same instance, because we've seen them matched up against each other time after time throughout the years, because they're looked at as physically the two strongest beings in the Marvel universe, at least of the superhero level community. And Hulk, of course, always gets portrayed as the bad guy in these instances, particularly when he was the mindless Hulk who just rampages and stomps and smashes. And there's been
Hulk
instances
does
where
smash.
there's been instances where he's actually been portrayed as pretty villainous, where in an issue of Thor, or I actually might be the Hulk's book, I'm not positive, but it was sometime in the 80s, and they're fighting it out because the Hulk's on a rampage, and Thor sees it, and he's trying to talk him out of it, and eventually it boils down to fisticuffs, and the Hulk winds up taking a hostage, holding a woman upside down, telling the Thor he's going to rip her in half if he doesn't, throw his hammer away so they can just fight with fists. And going even so far back as to when the Hulk left the Avengers in issue number 2 and came back in issue 3 with the Submariner ready to destroy them, that was the first ever Hulk-Thor fight. And they've always kind of been portrayed as never getting to a definitive finish, where either something stops them from fighting or one of them relents at the cause of the other and without really being defeated. Like Thor in the Fear Itself storyline, the Hulk is one of the beings taken over by the Seven Hammers, and he becomes I think he takes the name of Null, Breaker of Worlds. And while it's still technically the Hulk's persona, just evil and ramped up, he says to Thor at one point, he goes, you never could beat me. And Thor goes, no, maybe I never could, but you were always just a giant pain in the ass, and hits him so hard that he goes from New York to Transylvania. And not Transylvania as a joke, he literally lands in Transylvania. But they've always been the mega fight, kind of like your Hulk Hogan versus your Ultimate Warrior of superheroes. And like Defenders number 10 always sticks out, and the Avengers Defenders War, where they basically stand stalemated for an hour just trying to out-wrestle the other one. And this is one of my main points of contention whenever somebody tries to tell me that the Hulk is stronger than Thor. The Hulk gets stronger as he grows angrier or more enraged. If he's deadlocked in a stalemate for an hour by Thor, he's probably gotten pretty mad over that time. And Thor's still been able to hold him. So I always point to that as an example of why Thor is not only stronger than the Hulk, but capable of beating him if he really wanted to. You hear that, Radulich?
Let's not call out Mark. He's got his other... He can't respond. You can't poke at a guy who's not...
That's exactly why I'm doing it.
Don't be that guy.
I am Eric Bischoff calling out Vince McMahon for slamboree.
Alrighty, if you insist. Yeah, that was the only other one I think you're correct in bringing up. Those two have gone at it, and like you said, it's one of those kind of crazy things where, objectively speaking, by and large, Hulk might have more potential, strength, energy, etc., just because his rage is theoretically exponential. But you can't argue with results, and those two they're kind of batting the big, 500 against each other. They're the goose egg. Neither one can really get that definitive win. If you're a fan of independent pro wrestling, I suppose a couple of years ago this would be the American Dragon and Nigel McGuinness feud. They constantly get one up on each other in incremental ways, but they're just still kind of deadlocked at the end of the day. I just referenced two people who Pat is over there cursing me for bringing up. But hey, that's how life goes sometimes. All right. Anything else?
Thor is one of those guys who it's kind of difficult to match up with a real great villain who can challenge him in some way. In a lot of respects, similar to Superman. The difference being when they've brought villains who are on Superman's level, they've really had to reach for it in order to challenge him, like bringing back General Zod, the threat of Brainiac. But he doesn't have a lot of those physical foes who can do that. Thor is oftentimes thought of in the same way, but yet when you dig into the mythology and the characters that have been brought out, you can see a lot of them are on paper exponentially more powerful than he is. And he's still got to come up with and find ways to beat them. And I think that's one of the great things about Thor's storyline is people who don't necessarily read write Thor off as being a god, and so you can't really challenge him. It's boring. But if you go in and read the best Thor story arcs where they bring these characters out, you can see it's really the opposite of the case.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that was kind of the same thing that you and I ran into to a lesser degree, mind you. But when because prior to Man of Steel being released, you and I actually sat down on one of these and we talked about Superman's Rogues Gallery in preparation for that film coming out. And I was personally surprised when I kind of got into some of his villains that you've got some depth there. You've actually got some decent villains, and it's not just you got Zod and Luthor, and then everything kind of falls off. No, there's some pretty good villains in there, and Thor's is actually, I mean, it's one of those rogues galleries that doesn't get as much play as maybe it should, but when you get into it, when you start looking at the characters and what they represent and what they've accomplished as villains do, it's a really strong group of bad guys that he's that he's kind of racked up there that will come out and fight with him. And I will now have to look up, again, Gore the God Butcher storyline. And big ups to Benjamin J. Cologne for locating the fight between Thor and Hulk with a stalemate. And thanks to him and Jesse Starcher for playing the home game with us and providing pretty pictures to go along with our dialogue here. We appreciate you guys. I think that's everything for me then. I agree with your assessment. And let me say this. The Thor films made me a big fan of the character, and I'm now looking forward to getting into more of the literature on that side. So, Pat, thank you very much for being available to do this. I absolutely would not do Thor without you for this one, so thank you for that. I didn't want to have to try and find another Marvel villain at last notice because I was kind of set on Thor or Triple H, so thank you for that. And there used to be a shocking physical similarity between the two, back when Hunter had long hair.
Big burly blonde with hammers. You can't go wrong.
You really can't. And it's sad that he's not the champion.
It's very sad.
All right. All right, what do you got, Pat? What do you got to plug this week, Pat?
Well, on Sunday afternoon, Gavin Napier and myself will be discussing the fallout from this weekend's two major boxing cards, one of them being the long-awaited rematch between Manny Pacquiao and Timothy Bradley, the other being the 49-year-old ageless wonder, the alien Bernard Hopkins, looking to unify two light heavyweight championships when he fights knockout artist Babur Shumanov on Showtime. Also, you can, as always, hear me on Sunday night with our genuinely great host, Robert Winfree, who I thank so much for having me on again, on the 411 Ground and Pound radio show. We will talk fallout from this past weekend, actually tonight's Fight Night card, which features Big Nog against Big Country, and we will be previewing Wednesday's Tough Nations finale show.
Because the UFC does have more than one Australian on their roster, apparently.
Who knew?
I didn't. Honest to God, when they announced we're doing Tough Nations, it's going to be Canada and Australia, I went, wait a minute, you're having George Soteropoulos on there again? They're like, no, Kyle Noak. Oh, all right. I'll take your word for it.
I'm personally not interested until they do Tough Nations, Namibia versus Djibouti.
I'm down for that. I still want to see Haiti take on the Dominican Republic.
The battle for Hispaniola. Now that will draw ratings.
I'm venturing more so than Patrick Cote ever will. I'm sorry. I'm down on. I shouldn't be so negative about Patrick Cote. He's not.
Yeah, you should.
He's not a bad guy. Not a great fighter.
Bad guy and bad fighter, different things.
Yeah, he's not a bad guy. He's not a great fighter. All right. As for my plugs, Locked in the Guillotine is live every Friday in the MMA zone of 411mania.com. This week, I gave my predictions for UFC Fight Night, Nogueira versus Nelson. which actually wound up airing really early Friday morning. I just couldn't possibly have typed it out because I have to submit this Thursday. So you got my preview for that. I was right about almost everything except Ramsey Nijum, who surprised me, got a win. However, had I heard beforehand that he left the pit and got with a more legitimate training camp, I might have gone the other way. Just saying. Did not have all the information. I think everything else I was right. I was perfect on, so yay me. I can toot my own horn. It's my show. This Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern, the 411 Ground and Pound radio show is back. We did not have one last week, partially out of deference to Mark Radulich having left the show the week before, partially because WrestleMania was on and we would have actually been competing with the horrible, horrible Undertaker versus Brock Lesnar match. And the resulting shocking decision, it would have been oddly timed, but we're back in the saddle this week. Pat's on, and we're going to break down, like he said, we're going to break down the last fight night and preview the next one. And we'll talk about news. We might make fun of Nate Diaz, because it's fun to poke fun at the mentally handicapped folks.
Park in handicapped spaces while handicapped people make handicapped spaces.
I am partially convinced there's something disconnected in his brain at this point in time. Josh Thompson must have kicked him harder than we could have possibly imagined.
There's some painting in the chlorine in the Diaz family gene pool.
All right, enough fun at the expense of Nate Diaz. So you can tune in for all of that. The last edition of The Long Road to Ruin, I was guest hosting as Mark Radulich is firmly in the midst of the Jonas Exodus. He's got the different tribes. He's organizing them. They're on their way out of Egypt, folks. I can play that metaphor. Sean Comer and I talked the first 3 Saw movies. We expressed our undying love and appreciation for them and what they were able to accomplish. So look at that up on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network on April 22nd. That's not this Tuesday, but next Tuesday. Sean and I will be back, and we will be discussing the horrifyingly sudden fall from grace from that particular franchise. We'll be tackling Saws 4, 5, 6, and 7, the 7th one also known as Saw 3D. And you will hear ranting and raving and our profuse objections to the continued existence of various elements of that franchise. It'll be fun. We had the intellectual and adoring discussion last week. Next time around, you get the baggage. You get various profanities used in various fun ways. What everyone really tunes into that show for, I'm pretty sure. Robert Cooper has the Metal Hammer of Doom. That would be this Tuesday, I believe. If there's not a Long Road to Ruin, there's a Metal Hammer of Doom. They share the same day. They just go every other week. Jason Teasley holds down the sports section here at the Radulich and Broadcasting Network with From the Cheap Seats, which airs every Thursday. He, a couple of weeks ago, just wrapped up, he did his sports movie discussion. If you're into sports, he and Robert Cooper do a great job, have a lot of fun over there. And be sure to check out the Radulich, there's several other shows that I haven't mentioned, so be sure to check out the Radulich and Broadcasting Network for all of those. Stitcher, iTunes, subscribe, rate us 5 stars. We love you guys for it. We appreciate feedback. And I believe that's everything. Oh, I do not have a topic picked out next week as of this moment. Partially because I wasn't sure if I was going to get to Triple H or Thor this week, and I had to coordinate with Pat, so I didn't plan to next week. I have loosely been going Marvel, DC, so which means next week I would tackle another DC another DC Characters Rogues Gallery. So I will kind of hammer through that. Actually, the last edition of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, Sean Comer was on, and he and I talked about the villains of the Green Lantern franchise. We had a lot of fun. Check that out. Check out all the various editions of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. Some are good. Some are not so good. Some are just awesome, I'm assuming.
There was one show about Dr. Doom that was pretty awesome.
Yes, Dr. Doom was discussed. Actually, since we mentioned the Hulk, I think my second show, I had Mark on, and we talked about the Hulk, and the third one I had Cooper on, and we talked about the Hulk's villains. So I've been doing comic book guys for a long time, folks, off and on.
A lot of villains to work with.
Yeah, well, again, I had 2 shows. I had one where it was just the Hulk as a villain, and then we got to go through Rolk and the Absorbing Man and Thunderbolt Ross and all that fun stuff. So go back. It's in there. You can search, look them up. They're fun. I had fun with them. And I'm still promising to get to part 2 of my Terminator series eventually. I'll get there eventually. All right, so that's going to wrap things up here. Thank you again, everyone, for listening, live or recorded. Thank you for hitting the download button. Continue to support the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. We all appreciate it very much. So for Pat Mullen, who's holding down the fort on the East Coast, He is the Pugilistic Pontiff, and make sure to tune in, as he mentioned, to his and Gavin Napier's podcast, Talking Boxing. It's a lot of fun. Oh, just a quick question, Pat. How many times in boxing have you had two guys fight for a vacant interim title? Because I swear I was watching something the other night and I heard that thrown out there.
To put it in perspective, less than the UFC.
I don't think they've ever fought for a vacant interim title.
Well, generally, an interim title is declared active when the defending champion can't make a defense. They do an interim title in boxing to determine the way it's supposed to be, where it's a one-fight deal where they determine the next contender, and only in rare instances has an interim title fight resulted in a new champion, such as Vitaly Klitschko retiring as the WBC heavyweight champion, and the WBC had interim title fights where eventually Samuel Peter claimed the championship. He wound up losing it. Excuse me, not Samuel Peter. What am I thinking? Oleg Moskayev claimed the championship, and then he lost it to Sam Peter, who eventually lost it back to the returning Vitaly Klitschko, who had been given champion emeritus status and allowed him to challenge for the title in his first fight back.
So that's what GSP has. He's an emeritus champion at this point.
He should be if he's not already, but I doubt he is based on some rants we've heard. But it's okay because he's got a burgeoning movie career.
Hey, he was a better jobber than 80% of the WWE's roster right now, I felt. So good on George. For anyone who doesn't know, that's a reference to to Captain America: The Winter Soldier, wherein former UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre plays Batroc the Leaper and is summarily squashed in about 90 seconds by Captain America, as he is supposed to.
It is a good fight scene, though.
It is. I really enjoyed that whole fight sequence. I mean, you knew who was winning, and it was kind of comical, but it was supposed to be. I enjoyed it. So good on them for that end. Good on George. Poor guy. Just tore his ACL again last week, his other ACL. So speedy recovery. Continue with your career. Continue to criticize things the UFC does, because apparently you have more credence than those of us on the internet with podcasts, even though we're saying essentially the same thing. But good on you, George.
And Tamer still loves you.
Maybe that's where he got the idea. He listened to the Ground and Pound show, and he's begun to understand, and he's begun to carry our... he's come up with the same criticisms that we have.
They rip us off for everything else. Why should that be any different?
It's true. Now, hey, you know what? In the future, when they announce that Kate Upton will be Amora, we can point to you and say you called it.
I called it, I engineered it, and I should get 10% of her salary, but I will settle for a wink and a nod from her.
Alrighty, that's going to wrap us up tonight. Again, thank you everyone for joining. For the Pugilistic Pontiff, Pat Mullen, I'm Robert Winfree, reminding you that without good villains, all of your heroes are just weird guys in tights and capes. Good night, everybody.
So say good night to the bad guys.